The tension in the studio began long before anyone realized it. Richard Gere walked onto the stage with the familiar grace that had defined his decades-long career, and the audience erupted in warm applause, thrilled to see a Hollywood icon. But beneath his polite smile, he carried a firmness that hinted he wasn't in the mood for theatrics. He was there for a purpose, to talk about the humanitarian crisis he had been dedicating months of work to. Yet even before he settled into his chair, Joy Behar had a glint in her eye that suggested this interview would not follow the script he hoped for. From the moment the segment began, Richard tried steering the discussion to the refugee camps, their urgent needs, the political obstacles that were preventing aid from reaching the most vulnerable. His voice was calm but passionate, his words carefully chosen. But Joy, in full on-air personality mode, immediately pivoted toward the sensational. Instead of the humanitarian project, she dove into gossip, trying to unearth old stories he had long distanced himself from. Richard deflected once, then twice, keeping his tone steady. But every time he attempted to guide the conversation back to the cause, Joy cut across him with another probing, often invasive, question. The audience could feel the imbalance. Laughter faded. Polite smiles tightened. Even the other co-hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Joy, however, continued pressing, convinced she was simply doing her job, digging, prodding, stirring the pot for drama. Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands, and tried once more to explain why his mission mattered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lose his temper. But there was a pleading earnestness in his tone, as though he believed he could still redirect the energy of the segment. Joy wouldn't let him. Richard, she persisted, her voice rising slightly, people want to know what really happened. He cut her off, not harshly, but with unmistakable irritation. Joy, I'm not here to revisit stories that have been twisted and replayed for years. I'm here because there are families, children, who need help. If we could focus on that. She jumped back in before he could finish. But it's part of your past. You can't just ignore it. The studio dipped into an uneasy hush. The air grew thick. Richard sat back, eyes narrowing just a fraction, and something inside him seemed to snap into finality. He breathed out slowly, the kind of long exhale that signaled he had reached his limit. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, more powerful than if he had shouted. You know, I really believed this would be a meaningful conversation. But if you're more interested in sensational headlines than in real human suffering, then I don't see a reason to stay. Joy blinked, startled. The other hosts froze. A camera operator hesitated, unsure whether to zoom in or pan out. Richard Gere leaned forward, unclipped the microphone from his shirt, and set it down gently on the table. The small click echoed louder than expected. He pushed his chair back and stood with a calm that contrasted sharply with the shock rippling through the studio. Respect matters, he said quietly, his eyes meeting Joy's. And listening matters even more. Before anyone could respond, he turned and walked off the set. The silence held for several seconds, too long, too raw, before anyone dared breathe. The audience murmured, stunned. Joy shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of the magnitude of the moment, her earlier bravado draining away. The studio, normally buzzing with chatter and excitement, felt hollow in his absence, the weight of the confrontation lingering like a shadow. The atmosphere in the studio was deceptively bright, the stage glowing under the soft morning lights as Richard Gere made his entrance. The audience clapped enthusiastically, delighted to see him, and he acknowledged their welcome with a courteous nod. Yet beneath the polished composure, there was a perceptible weight in his expression. He had come for a deeply personal mission, to raise awareness about the humanitarian crisis unfolding overseas. Every detail of his appearance had been planned around amplifying that message. But almost immediately, he sensed the conversation was in danger of veering off course. Joy Behar greeted him with her usual blend of charm and sharp humor, but even her opening question undermined the tone he was trying to set. Instead of asking about his relief efforts, she launched straight into a pointed reference to a past controversy. Richard recovered seamlessly, offering a polite deflection, but he could already see where Joy was steering the interview. He glanced toward the other hosts, hoping one of them would redirect, but they sat waiting, scripts in hand, unsure how to intervene. Trying to steady the moment, Richard leaned in and began describing the conditions he had witnessed in the refugee camps. Families sleeping in makeshift shelters, volunteers stretched thin, children in need of medical care. His voice warmed with conviction, finally aligning the segment with the purpose he'd envisioned. For a brief moment, the studio quieted. Even the audience leaned forward, sensing the sincerity in his tone. But Joy interrupted with a sudden shift, her voice cutting through his explanation. "That's very touching, Richard, but before we go deeper into that, I have to ask, what's your response to the allegations that—" He stopped mid-sentence, the words freezing in his throat. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. Still, he maintained composure, offering a restrained smile. "Joy, with all due respect, that's not why I'm here." She ignored the boundary and pressed on, speaking over him. "Our viewers care about transparency. You can't expect us to pretend these things don't exist." Richard took a moment, pressing his palms together as if resisting the impulse to snap. The audience sensed the tension instantly, the applause signs unlit and forgotten. The air felt heavier now, charged with discomfort. The other hosts exchanged quick, nervous looks, silently pleading with Joy to ease off, but she was locked in, her tone insistent. He attempted once more to redirect. "Millions of people are suffering, and I sincerely hoped we could use this platform to shine a light on." Joy cut him off again, this time raising her eyebrows in mock surprise. "But don't you think your past affects how people see your activism?" Something inside Richard hardened. It wasn't anger that showed first, it was disappointment, deep and visible. The kind of disappointment one feels when good intentions are trivialized for entertainment. His expression shifted, the warmth draining from his eyes. He sat back, inhaled deeply, and finally spoke with a clarity that silenced the entire room. "I came here trusting this would be a conversation about compassion and humanity. But if the goal is to chase cheap drama instead of discussing real suffering, then I've clearly made a mistake." Joy opened her mouth, perhaps to laugh it off or pivot, but he was already unclipping his microphone. The tiny metallic click was startling in the stillness. He set it carefully on the table, an act far gentler than the intensity of the moment suggested. The host stared, stunned. Joy's expression faltered, her confidence cracking under the weight of his calm reproach. Richard stood, straightened his jacket, and looked directly at her. "Listening is a form of respect," he said quietly. "Maybe try leading with that." Without waiting for a response, he walked off the set, his retreat echoing louder than any outburst could have. The audience murmured in disbelief. The crew froze. Joy sat speechless, her earlier bravado swallowed by the silence he left behind. The entire studio felt suspended, the magnitude of the confrontation settling over them like an unexpected storm. The studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy, producers whispering into headsets, audience members settling into their seats, the co-hosts reviewing their cue cards. When Richard Gere walked onto the stage, the applause rose instantly, warm and enthusiastic. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that came from decades in the public eye. Yet there was something else beneath the surface, a seriousness, a focus that suggested today's appearance meant more to him than a typical promotional stop. He had come to speak for people whose voices rarely reached places like this. That alone filled him with purpose. Joy Behar welcomed him with her usual bright smile, but the spark in her eye hinted at mischief. She wasn't interested in the carefully planned conversation topics Richard and his team had submitted. She had her own agenda, her own instincts for what made good television. And unfortunately for Richard, those instincts were drawn to controversy like a magnet. He began calmly, speaking about the worsening conditions in a remote refugee region. He described overcrowded shelters, understaffed clinics, and children walking miles for clean water. The audience listened attentively. Even the hosts, at least for a moment, seemed genuinely engaged. But just as Richard started explaining the urgent need for medical supplies, Joy leaned forward, cutting across his sentence. "Richard, before we go any further," she said, her tone light but edged with provocation, "we have to address the elephant in the room." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Richard paused, brows tightening. He knew that tone. He had heard it before in interviews where the goal wasn't understanding but stirring. "Joy," he said softly, "I'd really prefer we stay on topic. People's lives." She waved a hand dismissively, laughing. "Oh, come on, Richard. This isn't a press release. Our viewers want authenticity. Let's talk about what everyone's truly curious about." He stared at her, the disappointment already forming. "I'm here to talk about a humanitarian emergency." She pressed on, ignoring the boundary he had clearly drawn. Sure, but don't you think your past controversies affect how people view your activism? Isn't it fair to ask whether you're being completely honest with yourself, and with them? The shift in the room was immediate. The audience murmured anxiously. One of the co-hosts glanced toward the producer's booth as if silently begging for intervention. But Joy was enjoying the moment too much to back down. Richard tried again. Joy, there are thousands of displaced families who need. She cut him off yet again. But transparency matters, Richard. Don't you think the public deserves answers? It was then that something in him broke, not explosively, not loudly, but decisively. The light in his eyes dimmed. His expression tightened not with anger but with a profound sense of futility. He lowered his hands slowly, letting them rest on the table, and looked at Joy with an intensity that made even the cameras hesitate. You're not listening, he said quietly. You're not listening to me, and you're certainly not listening to the people I came here to speak for. This, he gestured to the table between them, was supposed to be about compassion. About humanity. Not about dragging up old stories just to make headlines. Joy blinked, taken aback. The other hosts had gone completely still. Richard stood, the movement smooth but final. He unhooked his microphone, the soft click echoing through the silent studio. He placed it on the table, straightened his jacket, and looked directly at Joy. You have a platform people trust, he said. Imagine what good you could do if you used it to uplift instead of antagonize. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked off the set. The audience gasped, a few even applauded in support. The host stared, speechless. Joy sat frozen, shocked that her attempt at drama had driven one of Hollywood's most respected figures to walk out on live television. And in the quiet that followed, the weight of the moment settled heavily over the studio, proof that even in a room full of lights and applause, one act of integrity could outshine everything else.